The envelope was cream-colored, edged in gold foil, and it sat on top of Hannah Yoon's mail like it belonged there. She almost didn't open it. She almost set it aside with the electric bill and the dry cleaning ticket and went on with her Tuesday. But her name was written across the front in careful calligraphy, and the weight of the paper made her fingers slow down. Inside was a wedding invitation. The groom's name was Marcus Coleman, her husband of 22 years. The bride's name was Yuna Park, her best friend since they were 11 years old, riding bicycles through the same Los Angeles Koreatown neighborhood, promising each other in broken Konglish that they would grow old together no matter what life did to them. Hannah stood in her doorway on a gray October afternoon, holding proof that both her marriage and her oldest friendship had ended without her ever being told. She did not scream. She did not cry. She read the date at the bottom 11 days away and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world tonight, tell us where you're tuned in from. And if you believe some betrayals are too big to survive, hit subscribe, because this story is about to show you exactly how wrong that belief can be. Hannah had married Marcus the year she turned 26, in a small hall in Gardena with rented chairs and a karaoke machine borrowed from her uncle, because the caterer had cancelled that morning and nobody cared. She remembered him then broad-shouldered, hungry, terrified of failing the expectations of a family that had built something out of nothing on the other side of the Pacific. Her father, Chairman Han Dae-young, had grown a modest construction firm from a single crew of 6 men laying foundations in the San Fernando Valley, and when Marcus married into the family, the old man had done something unusual. He had not simply handed his son-in-law a job. He had made him earn every promotion, watching him for years before finally naming him CEO when his own health began to fail. What almost no one knew, not Marcus, not the board, not a single person outside of one law office downtown, was that Chairman Han had never fully let go. Before he died, he had placed 40% of the company's controlling shares into a trust in his daughter's name. Silent. Undocumented in any place Marcus would think to look. Hannah had signed papers she barely understood at the time in a lawyer's office 6 years ago, and then she had gone home and made her husband's dinner and never mentioned it again, because her father had asked her not to, and because at the time she had trusted Marcus enough that it hadn't seemed to matter. Mattered now. Because the company Marcus ran, Han Coleman Development, was 3 weeks from finalizing a merger with a Nigerian-American infrastructure firm worth more money than Hannah could picture in her head. And no merger could close without the signature of every shareholder, including hers, which meant that somewhere in the 11 days before that wedding, her husband needed something from her that he had not yet found the courage to ask for. Hannah called Yuna first. Her hand shook dialing the number she called 1,000 times before, the number she still knew by heart after 40 years of friendship, through job losses and funerals and the birth of Yuna's own 2 children, whom Hannah had held in the hospital before their own mother had fully come out of the anesthesia. Yuna picked up on the second ring. Her voice was bright, careless, the voice of someone who did not yet know she'd been caught. "Girl, hey, I was just about to call you. I got the invitation," Hannah said. There was a silence on the line that lasted 4 full seconds. Hannah counted them. "Hannah!" Yuna's voice dropped, all the brightness gone out of it in an instant. "That was a mistake. The planner sent the save the dates to the wrong list. I told her 100 times to double-check. Was the wedding a mistake too?" Another silence, longer this time. "I wanted to tell you myself," Yuna finally said. "Not like this." "When?" Hannah asked. "When were you going to tell me, Yuna? Before or after you married my husband?" Something in Yuna's tone shifted then, hardening into something Hannah had never heard from her before, not in 4 decades of friendship. "He's not just your husband, Hannah. People change. People grow apart. You've been so buried in your own head about your father's company, you didn't even see what was happening in your own house." The words landed like a slap, and worse than the affair itself was the accusation underneath it that somehow this was Hannah's fault, that her grief and her silence had made room for this. Hannah hung up without another word, because she understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that this was not a woman who was ashamed. This was a woman defending territory she believed she had already won. That night, Marcus came home at 11, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, and found his wife sitting at the kitchen table with the invitation laid out in front of her like evidence at a trial. He didn't deny it. That was the part that broke something loose in Hannah's chest. He simply sat down across from her, loosened his tie and said, "I was going to tell you next week." "Were you going to tell me before or after you moved her into a house I don't know about?" Hannah asked. Because she had done some digging of her own that afternoon, quietly, the way her father had taught her to move when something needed to be understood before it needed to be fought. Marcus's jaw tightened. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized from 22 years of marriage: not love, not guilt, but calculation. He was deciding how much truth she could be trusted with. "The merger needs to close by the end of the month," he said finally. "The Bankole Group is getting nervous about delays. I need your signature on the shareholder release, Hannah. That's all this is really about. Once that's done, we can handle the rest like adults." "The rest?" Hannah repeated softly. "You mean our marriage? You're calling the end of our marriage the rest?" He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. And in that silence, Hannah understood something that would change the shape of everything that came after. Her husband had not fallen in love and stumbled into a mistake. He had a timeline, deadline, a document he needed her to sign, and a wedding scheduled 11 days out that would only make sense if he believed, with total confidence, that she would give him what he wanted before then. She lay awake long after he'd gone to sleep in the guest room that night, letting herself remember things she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years. The first apartment in Gardena with the mismatched furniture. The nights she'd worked a second shift at her father's warehouse so Marcus could finish his contractor's license. The miscarriage in their 8th year of marriage that neither of them had ever spoken about again. Not once, as if silence could undo grief instead of simply hiding it. She had given this man every quiet, unglamorous sacrifice a life together required, and he had repaid her by choosing, deliberately, the one person on earth who should have been forbidden to him, not a stranger, not someone easy to hate, but Una, who had held her hand in the delivery room that never delivered a living child, who had known the exact shade of Hannah's heartbreak because she had watched it happen in real time. That was the cruelty underneath the cruelty. Not that he had betrayed her. That he had let the one person who understood her most become the instrument of it. By morning, the grief hadn't gone anywhere, but something harder had grown up around it, the way scar tissue forms over a wound that never quite finishes healing. Hannah made breakfast the way she always had: rice and banchan set out quietly, coffee left warming on the counter, not because she had forgiven anything, but because she needed him to believe, for a few more days, that nothing in her had changed at all. She called her younger sister, Grace, from the garage that afternoon, sitting in the dark with the door closed so no one in the house could hear her voice break for the first time since the invitation arrived. "Say it again," Grace said, when Hannah finished telling her everything in a voice flattened out by shock. "Say it slow, because I need to understand how long you've been carrying this by yourself before you called me." "I didn't know until yesterday," Hannah said. "That's not what I'm asking," Grace said, gentler now. "I'm asking how long you've been carrying the feeling that something was wrong, even before you had proof of it." Hannah was quiet for a long moment, because the honest answer embarrassed her. "Almost a year," she admitted. "I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself a marriage doesn't survive 22 years by being suspicious of every quiet dinner and every late meeting. Or maybe it survives by being smart about which fights are worth losing sleep over, and saving your strength for the one that actually matters," Grace said. "You're not imagining anything anymore, Uni. Now you get to decide what you're going to do with the truth instead of just surviving it quietly the way you always do." It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was the first thing anyone had said to her since the invitation arrived that didn't ask her to be smaller, quieter, more forgiving than the situation deserved. Hannah hung up the phone and sat in the dark garage a while longer, and when she finally walked back into the house, something in the set of her shoulders had changed, even if no one there was paying close enough attention to notice it. The next morning, Hannah did not go to the lawyer Marcus expected her to use, the firm's longtime counsel, A man named Mr. Ridley, who had drafted half the documents in the company's history and who, Hannah now suspected, answered to Marcus far more than to fairness. Instead, she drove 2 hours to see a woman named Michelle Okafor, an old family friend of her father's, a Nigerian-American attorney semi-retired now but sharp as broken glass. Michelle read through the trust documents Hannah had kept hidden in a safety deposit box for 6 years, and her expression changed slowly from polite interest to something closer to alarm. "Hannah," she said, "do you understand what you're holding? I understand my father left me shares. You're holding 40% of a company that's about to merge for $400 million, Michelle said. Do you understand what that means if your husband finalizes this deal without your knowledge, and then divorces you the following week?" Hannah felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. "It means he gets everything and I get nothing." "It means worse than that," Michelle said, sliding a page across the desk. "Look at the language here. This isn't a standard release. This clause doesn't just ask for your signature on the merger. It asks you to relinquish your trust shares entirely permanently in exchange for what looks like a token buyout. Whoever drafted this wanted you to sign away your inheritance thinking you were only approving a business deal." Hannah stared at the clause until the words blurred. "Who drafted it?" Michelle turned to the signature block at the bottom of the document preparation page, the small print almost no one ever reads. "It was reviewed by outside counsel before it reached Ridley's desk," she said. "A firm called Park and Associates." Hannah's stomach dropped. Unipark's older brother ran a small contract law practice downtown. A practice Marcus had quietly begun using 8 months ago the exact month. Hannah would later calculate that the affair had likely begun. This had never been about love catching two people by surprise. This had been engineered slowly and patiently, by someone who understood exactly what Chairman Hahn had built and exactly how to take it apart, one careless signature at a time. If you've ever trusted the wrong person with something you couldn't get back, let us know in the comments, and if this story is starting to get under your skin, tell us by hitting that like button, because it's about to get a great deal more personal. Hannah did not go home that night. She checked into a hotel near the airport and sat with the documents spread across the bed, trying to decide what kind of woman she was going to be for the rest of this. She could sign nothing and disappear into a long, ugly legal war that could take years and might still end with her losing everything to lawyers' fees alone. Or she could do what her father had actually trained her for. All those Saturday mornings she'd spent as a girl sitting quietly in the corner of his office while he negotiated contracts twice her age, she could learn exactly what the other side needed and make them come to her for it. It was Michelle who suggested the name that changed everything. "The Bankole Group," she said. "Do you know who's leading their side of the deal?" Hannah didn't. She had never once been included in a single meeting about her own inheritance. "A man named Ode Bankole," Michelle said. "I knew his mother years ago in Lagos before her family moved to Houston. He built that infrastructure firm from a single crew of pipefitters into one of the largest minority-owned contractors on the West Coast. He has a reputation. Meticulous, old-fashioned about honor in a way that surprises people who've only dealt with his competitors. If he finds out this merger is being built on a forged understanding of your consent, he will not simply walk away quietly. He'll want to know why." 2 days later, Hannah arranged, through a mutual contact at Michelle's old firm, to meet Ode Bankole for coffee, not as Marcus Coleman's estranged wife, but as Hannah Hahn, daughter of the company's founder and holder of shares no one on the American side of the deal had bothered to verify. He was younger than she expected, maybe 50, tall, with the careful stillness of a man who had learned long ago that saying less usually revealed more. He listened to her for nearly an hour without interrupting once, and when she finally finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, "in my family, when a man asks you to trust him with a legacy, the least he can do is be honest about what he intends to do with it. I have flown out from Houston 4 times to close this deal. Not once has your husband mentioned that his own wife holds 40% of the company he claims to fully control." "He didn't think I'd find out," Hannah said. Ade studied her for a long moment. "Or he thought you would sign whatever was placed in front of you, because that is what he has always known you to do." He paused. "Was he wrong?" He is about to find out, Hannah said, and for the first time since the invitation had arrived in her mailbox, something that felt almost like strength moved through her chest. Ade studied her a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say what came next. There is something you should understand before we go any further, he said. In 3 days, my board expects a signed release confirming that every shareholder has consented to this merger freely and without coercion. If I sign off on that release knowing it isn't true, my name is attached to the fraud as much as your husband's. So I am not simply doing you a courtesy, Mrs. Coleman. I am protecting myself as much as you. Then we want the same thing, Hannah said. For now, Ade said, and there was something almost like a smile in it, careful and dry. Let's find out how long that lasts once the money is actually at stake. It was not, she would realize later, a warm thing to say. But it was an honest one, and after weeks of being lied to by people who had claimed to love her, honesty felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in a long time. Ade Bankole did not simply take her word for it. Over the following days he quietly pulled his firm's own legal team back into the file, and what they found confirmed everything Michelle had suspected and more. The release Hannah had been asked to sign wasn't the only irregularity. Company funds nearly $2 million over the preceding year had been routed through a shell consulting account for strategic advisory services. The account belonged to Park and Associates, Yuna's brother. The affair had not simply been an emotional betrayal. It had been the visible edge of a much larger theft, one that had been draining Chairman Han's company for months, while Marcus distracted himself with a wedding he believed would legally seal his access to everything his father-in-law had built. But Marcus did not know any of this had been discovered. And in 11 days, shrinking now to 7, he still believed his wife would either sign quietly or disappear entirely, too heartbroken and humiliated to fight. He was about to learn that the woman who had spent 22 years setting out his breakfast every morning and never once raising her voice in an argument had spent those same 22 years learning, from a man far shrewder than him, exactly how patience becomes power. She thought the worst had already happened to her. She had no idea the wedding itself was about to become the most dangerous day of her life, and if you want to see exactly how far Yuna and Marcus were willing to go to protect what they'd stolen, make sure you're subscribed, because the truth was closer than any of them realized. 5 days before the wedding, Hannah came home to find her front door unlocked, though she was certain she had locked it that morning. Nothing inside had been taken. But the safety deposit box key she kept in a small dish by her bed had been moved, not stolen, simply moved, 3 inches to the left, as though someone had picked it up, considered it, and set it back down deliberately so she would notice. It was not theft. It was a message. We know what you're holding and we can reach it whenever we choose. She didn't sleep at home again after that. And 2 days later, on the drive to what she told no one was actually a meeting with Michelle to finalize an emergency injunction, Hannah's car brakes failed on the on-ramp to the 110. She survived only because traffic was slow enough that she was able to coast the car into the guardrail rather than into the concrete divider ahead. The mechanic who examined the vehicle afterward found something that made his face go pale, not simple wear, but a brake line that had clearly been cut, cleanly, with a tool, and reconnected loosely enough to fail under highway pressure but not immediately in her driveway. Hannah sat in the mechanic's waiting room with her hands shaking, staring at her phone, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, she felt real fear instead of anger. Someone had moved from betrayal to attempted murder, and she understood, with a cold clarity that made her sick to her stomach, that whoever had done this believed she was close to something worth killing for. She called Ade Bankole before she called the police. "Do not go home tonight," he told her, and there was an edge in his voice she hadn't heard before, controlled fury dressed up as calm. "I will send a car. We will finish what we started." What almost no one, not Marcus, not Yuna, not even Mr. Ridley, understood was that Ade Bankole had already begun quietly moving the Bankole Group's position. The merger contract contained a clause, standard in deals of this size, allowing either party to withdraw immediately and without penalty if evidence emerged of fraud, misrepresentation, or criminal conduct connected to either company's leadership. Ade had spent the last 3 days building a file thick enough to end Marcus's career the moment it was opened. The brake line was the final piece he needed, not proof of who had cut it, but proof that someone close to this deal was frightened enough to try. The wedding day arrived under a bright, cruel October sky, the kind of clean blue morning that makes tragedy feel obscene by comparison. The venue was a restored estate outside Pasadena, chosen by Yuna for its white columns and its Instagram-worthy staircase, filled with 200 guests who had no idea they were about to witness the public unraveling of two families at once. Marcus stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, sweating slightly despite the mild weather, glancing every few minutes toward the back doors as though expecting trouble. He had not heard from Hannah in 6 days. Her silence had felt to him like surrender. He believed because it was easier to believe that she had accepted defeat and gone somewhere to grieve quietly, the way she always had. Yuna came down the aisle in white lace, radiant, waving at guests, playing the role of blushing bride with the practiced ease of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind for months. Her brother sat in the third row, checking his phone with the faint nervous energy of a man whose entire legal career depended on a deal closing before anyone looked too closely at his firm's books. The ceremony had reached the exchange of vows when the doors at the back of the hall opened. Hannah walked in wearing a simple navy dress, not a costume of vengeance, not dressed to compete with the bride dressed like a woman who had come to conduct business. Beside her walked Ade Bankole, Michelle Okafor, and 2 attorneys from the Bankole group carrying folders that would end up mattering far more than any wedding program. 200 heads turned at once. Yuna's smile froze mid-formation, the practiced radiance curdling into something closer to panic. Marcus's face went the color of old paper. "Hannah," he said, his voice cracking across the silent hall. "What are you doing here?" "Finishing what we started," Hannah said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake at all. "You wanted my signature before this wedding, Marcus. I came to give you my answer in front of everyone who's going to need to hear it." She turned to the guests, Yuna's mother in the front row, dabbing her eyes moments earlier with happy tears now frozen in confusion. Marcus's business partners in their good suits, the county's assistant district attorney, whom Ade had personally invited that morning after reviewing the shell account evidence with his own legal counsel. 11 days ago, Hannah said, I received a wedding invitation for my husband's marriage to my best friend of 40 years. I want to thank them both honestly, because it forced me to finally look closely at something my father left me 6 years ago, 40% ownership of Han Coleman Development, hidden in a trust neither of them knew existed. A murmur ran through the crowd like electricity through water. For the past 8 months, Hannah continued, nearly $2 million has been quietly moved out of that company into a shell account controlled by Park and Associates. She turned toward Yuna's brother, whose phone had slipped from his hand and clattered against the marble floor, in exchange for, according to the paperwork, strategic advisory services that never actually took place. 3 days ago, someone cut the brake line on my car. The color drained fully from Yuna's face. Hannah, that has nothing to do with me. I never said it was you, Hannah said quietly. But I notice you're the only one in this room who just felt the need to say it wasn't. Ade Bankole stepped forward then, calm and precise, and addressed the room the way a man addresses a boardroom rather than a wedding. The Bankole Group is formally withdrawing from the merger effective this morning, pending a full criminal investigation into fund diversion at Han Coleman Development. We have already been in contact with the district attorney's office. The assistant district attorney rose from her seat near the back, and the sound of her heels against the wood floor was the loudest thing in the room. Marcus's legs seemed to fail him at the same moment his fortune did. He reached for the altar railing, and the officiant, a family friend who had clearly rehearsed a very different ceremony, backed away in confusion. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a woman Hannah didn't recognize, one of Yuna's cousins, she would learn later, began recording on her phone, and within the hour, grainy footage of the moment would already be circulating among wedding guests who couldn't quite believe what they had just watched with their own eyes. Yuna's brother rose from his seat, his face gray, and made it 3 unsteady steps toward the exit before one of the Bankole Group's attorneys said, quietly but clearly enough for the front 3 rows to hear, I'd sit back down if I were you. There are people outside who would very much like to speak with you before you go anywhere. Hannah, Marcus said, and for the first time in 22 years, Hannah heard real terror in his voice. Please. Whatever's happening, we can fix this, you and me. "There is no you and me," Hannah said. "There hasn't been for a long time. You just didn't want to admit it until you needed something from me." The twist, when it finally surfaced fully in the days that followed, changed everything the guests thought they had witnessed that morning. It had not simply been Una seducing a vulnerable, unhappy husband. Investigators would later find text messages over a year old, in which Una had first approached Marcus not out of love, but out of old resentment toward Hannah's family. Una's father had once been a junior partner at Chairman Han's original crew, pushed out decades earlier in a dispute over stolen equipment that had nearly bankrupted the company before it grew into anything. Una had grown up hearing her father's bitterness about the Han family's success. Marrying into it, quietly stripping it apart from the inside, had been less a romance and more a 40-year-old grudge finally collecting its debt. The affair had never been an accident of the heart. It had been the last move in a plan laid before Hannah was even born. If you suspected something was hiding underneath this story from the very first envelope, tell us in the comments where the signs were, and if you love a story where the truth finally catches up to the people who thought they'd buried it, subscribe now, because the fall was only the beginning of what came next. In the weeks that followed, Han Coleman development did not collapse, though it came close. With Chairman Han's original trust intact and Hannah now holding both her original shares and emergency operational control granted by the board, Ade Bankol's firm quietly restructured its involvement this time as a direct partner with Hannah, not with Marcus, and not with anyone whose signature had been built on a lie. Marcus was removed from his position within the month, facing his own set of questions from investigators about how much he had known regarding the diverted funds, even if he hadn't orchestrated the theft himself. The board, once Ade's file landed on their desks, moved faster than Hannah expected within 2 weeks. An emergency shareholder vote had stripped Marcus of every operational title he'd spent 20 years accumulating, and the company's outside counsel quietly began negotiating the terms of his exit before the criminal case had even reached a courtroom. Una's brother was indicted first, and in the scramble to protect herself, Una gave investigators the full history of the scheme, hoping cooperation might soften what was coming for her. It did not soften much. She pleaded to a reduced charge that still carried real prison time, and the last Hannah heard of her secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance who hadn't yet learned to stop mentioning her name, was that she had moved back in with her mother, her law license under her brother's care indefinitely suspended, waiting to learn exactly how many years the state intended to take from her. The marriage that had never technically finished being solemnized was annulled before it had properly begun, a small mercy that felt, to everyone watching, like the universe closing a door that should never have been opened in the first place. Hannah did not celebrate any of it, not really. She sat with Michelle one evening months later. The company's quarterly reports spread across the table between them, and admitted the thing she had been carrying quietly since the day the invitation arrived. "I keep waiting to feel like I won," she said. "I don't feel like I won anything. I feel like I survived something I never should have had to survive." "Those are not the same thing," Michelle agreed. "But surviving it with your name still standing, and your father's company still yours, that matters more than winning ever would have." Ade Bankol, for his part, remained a careful and respectful presence in the company's affairs and slowly, in Hannah's life, not a rescuer, never framed that way, but a man who had simply chosen, at the one moment it counted, to stand on the side of the truth instead of the side of convenience. Their partnership, professional first and something gentler later, was built on the one thing her marriage had quietly stopped offering years before anyone admitted it out loud: the belief that she deserved to be told the truth. There was a morning, almost a year later, when Hannah stood in the same office her father used to work from, signing her name to a fully restructured partnership agreement with the Bankol Group, this time with her own signature at the top of the page instead of buried in the fine print of someone else's plan. Ade stood beside her, quiet as always, and when she set the pen down he said simply, "Your father would have signed it the same way." She hadn't expected the tears that came then, sudden and unguarded, not for the company, not for the money, but for the 6-year-old memory of a man who had trusted her with more than anyone else ever had, and who had quietly built her a way out of a trap he must have somehow sensed was coming, long before she ever saw the shape of it herself. She thought often, in those quieter months, about the version of herself who had made breakfast that first morning after the invitation arrived, smiling at a man she already knew had chosen someone else, simply to buy herself the time to understand what she was truly fighting for. It had cost her something to be that patient, to swallow that particular grief in silence while she learned the shape of the trap closing around her. But it had also taught her, in a way 22 years of marriage never had, exactly how much steel had been sitting quietly underneath her own gentleness the entire time. Marcus called once, months later, from a number she didn't recognize, and left a voicemail she listened to only once. He didn't ask for forgiveness exactly. He asked if she thought things could have gone differently, if he'd simply told her the truth from the beginning instead of building a wedding to bury it. She never called him back. Some questions, she had learned, don't deserve an answer. They deserve to be left exactly where the person who asked them left everything else that mattered. Too late, and entirely on their own. Before we close this story out, if it moved you even a little, subscribe, share it with someone who needs the reminder that betrayal doesn't always win, and tell us in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking away tonight. Because in the end, the lesson of Hannah Yoon's wedding invitation was never really about revenge. It was about the quiet danger of being underestimated by people who mistake gentleness for weakness, and the strange grace that sometimes comes when the truth arrives disguised as an invitation to someone else's celebration. Marcus and Yuna had spent months building a wedding designed to bury the past. Instead, they built the exact stage on which it finally stood up, in front of everyone, and refused to stay buried any longer. Some doors close so loudly that everyone in the room finally hears the truth that had been whispering behind them all along.